Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk, exploring the issues affecting all of our lives. I'm your host, Austin Harris. Today, we continue our series of discussion on a topic that regrettably the PACT government has thus far failed to fully address, that being our economy. More specifically, what is in store for our economy over the next year and beyond. We began this series on our second episode, and back once again to help us explore the topic further, it is our pleasure to once again host the former Minister of Finance, a qualified accountant, the leader of the opposition, the Honorable Roy McTaggart. Mr. McTaggart, let me say once again, what a pleasure it is to have you back in studios.
And thank you to Austin for having me back. I always enjoy being with you and sharing in my thoughts on these important topics. It is really an important topic and one that the government has not really addressed in any real way. And to be honest with you, they really need to. So I am hoping that the Premier will once again speak to the country and share what his government is contemplating about the economy. The Premier really needs to show the country that he and his government are clued in and are looking down as to what is coming and considering how it is that they can address it. I've said before, and I've said it again today, the issues that we are grappling with now are not going away in the short to medium term. They're here for some time, and we have to face up to that. And anything we do needs to take that and give consideration to these issues that we are struggling and facing with.
Indeed, sir. Well, let's begin with some of those issues, as you say, that we are struggling with or grappling with. On the 7th of June, the World Bank published an economic report which read, and I quote, "Compounding the damage from the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has magnified the slowdown of the global economy, which is entering what could become a protracted period of feeble growth and elevated inflation. That raises the risk of stagflation with potentially harmful consequences for middle and low-income economies alike." Now, just a quick note for our listeners, stagflation simply means a time of reduced economic growth, increased unemployment, and increased cost in common household goods. Now, the very next day, on June 8th, the Premier, speaking before the Royal Fidelity Economic Outlook, acknowledged that Cayman must prepare for more disruption, but went on to say Cayman's economy is still poised to grow this year and the next. Would you agree with his point of view?
That's a very good question, Austin. I think a lot depends on just when a lot of these issues internationally that are emerging actually trickle down and start to affect the Cayman Islands, as to whether you will see continued growth this year and into 2023. I know that's part of their forecast. And I think I would say, I hope he's right. But to me, it's iffy, and it's about a 50-50 chance right now, one way or another. But I see everything that I'm seeing and reading tells me that there are some very tough times that lie ahead of us. The World Bank report that you mentioned indicated that global growth is expected to slump from 5.7% in 2021 to 2.9% in 2022. So that's almost a halving of economic growth, and is significantly lower than what was anticipated just in January. So things have changed dramatically in these last 6 months. I think what you will see is that financial services will continue to grow over 2022 and 2023. But the industry has been facing headwinds for many years, and it looks like they are set to continue during this time frame as well. And so what you can see and anticipate, certainly in financial markets, is that there will be significant volatility that is set to continue for some time, as well as the demands for even more regulations and the ever-present threat of sanctions by the EU and other world bodies against offshore financial centers. So financial services has served us well throughout the years, and even through the pandemic, it really kicked in and provided that support that was so desperately needed. But there never is any guarantee for the future. And we need to continue to take seriously the threats from the EU and elsewhere. And that's why I was really dumbfounded by the government's initial refusal to set up the overseas offices in Brussels and Washington to protect the interests of the financial services sector. We have effectively lost a year, and that's a year we can never reclaim or get back. So I think I'm happy to see that they are moving forward.
In my humble opinion, Mr. Leader, that was a completely political, if not reckless move on the part of the PACT. But thankfully, in the end, they agreed that the need for overseas offices were necessary in order for us to remain competitive. But equally as important, sir, financial services continues to face headwinds, as you pointed out. And the PACT government, I don't believe, have fully addressed this. Now, whilst financial services is important to our economy, so too are other things, like tourism.
And I have to agree with you there, Austin. You know, I think it was certainly unhelpful to financial services because the industry all supported the need for the offices overseas. And I might add, industry supported the location of those offices. So, you know, we need to get that dealt with, and we need to get those offices operational and functioning. There's never been a more critical time in our history, I think, than for us to have this type of presence internationally, because the attacks are coming from all sides, and we need to be as prepared as we can be. But turning now to tourism, let me put it in perspective for our viewers and listeners. Tourism is a very big part of our overall economy. It contributes about 20 to 25% of our overall gross domestic product, or GDP. In contrast, financial services is probably double that size in terms of its contribution to the GDP, and at about 50%. So it gives you a bit of perspective, but what tourism does for us, it provides quite a bit of overall employment for Caymanians and who service that market. And we in the progressives did expect to see strong pent-up demand as we began to reopen. But we also understood that in the medium to longer term of the recovery of tourism would be vulnerable, especially if consumer confidence in our key markets fell and consumers were facing falling incomes due to the bite of high inflation and the fear of a possible recession. That is why on every occasion that I could do so, I kept reminding the government that the return of tourism would be slow and the sector needed assistance to continue for some time. Not just because families were hurting and needed help, but also to ensure that as tourism returned, we had the people and the businesses in place to cater to our visitors. That's why Moses Kekaunnel, when he was tourism minister, worked so hard to help keep Caymanian businesses and people in the tourism sector afloat. It was the right thing to do then, and it is the right thing to do now, to help people survive and to help the sector survive. So we're not talking about two separate things.
Well, Mr. Leader, that sounds, if I may say it, a little gloomy and doesn't really bode well for Cayman at all.
Austin, I really want to assure people and the listeners that I am not preaching doom and gloom. Far be it from me. But I think it's important that navigating the coming choppy waters requires a government that is sure-footed and able to respond positively and decisively to the challenges that are looming. And I have to say, so far, I have not seen this.
Well, Mr. Leader, that brings me to another point, which was a statement made by the Premier also at the Royal Fidelity Conference. He stated, and I quote, that his government would continue our historic prudent money management, but included an income buffer without increasing debt, which was really a contradiction to his Minister of Finance, who earlier in the year had proposed a bullet bond, which, as we know, would only increase that level of debt. Thankfully, you and the opposition raised the alarm, and the government acknowledged this and took the bullet bond off the table.
You know, Premier Panton obviously had one view, and his minister, finance minister, had another, and those comments did not meet up with each other. But we spoke strongly against the bullet bond, and in the end, I believe common sense prevailed. A bullet bond would have set back all the gains we had made over the last 8 years. I'm convinced that if we had not spoken out, the government seemed set to move forward with their plans. Similarly to my question in Parliament, I do believe that if we had not drawn attention to the rising inflation when speaking in Parliament, that nothing would have been done and said by the government.
Earlier this month, the government announced that it was scrapping that bullet bond idea, and instead they would be using the line of credit, which was secured by the former administration, and they would then be investing some $393 million to offset interest costs by investing in U.S. two-year Treasury notes. Could this be the income buffer that the Premier was referring to in at the RF conference?
You rightfully highlighted the fact that the government recently decided to draw down on the line of credit that we had put in place prior to the meeting office. And, you know, I do agree that it definitely looks like it can be and is the income buffer that the Premier might have been talking about at the RF conference. I do believe if their intention is to spend the money and use it in the future, that it probably was not such a bad idea to go ahead and draw it down.
You did state that borrowing is a good idea if the government spends that money, presumably spending it to provide economic relief to our citizens, not necessarily investing it in T-bills.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an important observation to be made, Austin. And, you know, one of the best ways that I see certainly for the in the short to medium term is if they can use some of that money to help people who are most in need right now. Because to my thinking and what I see, the response from the government has not been very decisive and forthcoming. And, you know, that's the best thing you can do to help your people. And I made comment previously that I thought that certainly in terms of their capital and budget spending, stuff that if they manage things correctly, they would not need to have to borrow at all. But having done so, this is exactly what we set it up for an emergency, a rainy day.
Yes. And
so they could take a page from that original intent and use some of the money to help our people who are in real danger right now. So let me give you a couple of ideas that we have been floated and I have said publicly that they could consider. The first off would be to ensure that the Water Authority, one, does not increase rates on a populace at this point in time. They have the ability to do that, and we know that there is an application before OFREG for an increase in rates. So they could pause that and leave that and say not before 2023. So we give some relief there. Second thing that they can look at is the rollback of the taxes on fuel. And you see the term being used quite extensively in the US. It's a tax holiday. And that would put some real funding in people's pockets. Everybody gets to feel that.
this is fuel at the pumps.
Fuel at the pumps. And they might even consider reducing as well the fuel on that duties that are being paid on fuel to CUC. Mm-hmm. There is a 25-cent per gallon fee that's on that. And, you know, I think if they were to give us a holiday for the next 6 months on that as well, people would see a reduction in their their fees as well, or their electricity bills.
Indeed, indeed. And of course, there was also the recommendation for retirees and veterans.
Yeah, that's another one I think that's just so important as well. I think what we have to remember is that this group of people, retirees and pensioners, and those depending on subsistence and assistance from the government on an ongoing basis, look, they're on a fixed income, and that for most who are on pension, and there are many thousands of them, they don't have the flexibility and they don't have the spare money that to allow them to be able to absorb the increases that we are experiencing. So I think it is important. That's just some ways in which it could help people in a very tangible way. And the thing is, I mean, if you talk about if someone like the Water Authority needs funding as a result of them foregoing their any rate increases, it is something quite easily that the government could take care of and provide that, and all around really make some positive steps towards alleviating the pain that our citizens are feeling at this point in time.
Now, I can hear the critics already saying, you know what, well, if it's so good, why didn't you do it during your administration? But the truth and fact is that it was done under the former administration, and these efforts to reduce the impact to the pain that we're feeling today.
Yeah, and that I think is was a hallmark, I think, of the two Progressives administrations of which I was a part of, and the financial strategy that we had pursued. I can't recall a time in my life, certainly at all, where you've had a situation where two governments went through full terms where there were no increases in taxes or fees that were placed on that the population required to pay. In fact, we actually reduced it. We reduced the burden. That's unheard of. And we pursued a policy of trying of saving for a rainy day. They're generating substantial surpluses and putting money away so that for that rainy day. And that rainy day came in 2020 with COVID, and the economy took a real nosedive. And the other thing I think we have to remember, even while doing all of that, we still found money to help people. We still increased the assistance that we gave to those most vulnerable and most needy of it in our society, including veterans, seamen, and those on permanent financial assistance from the government. All of those things were taken care of. We just acted prudently, and we really managed our program of spending to make sure that we could accommodate it in the time frame in which we had. And I think this government is departing from all of that.
Yes.
Everything that we had planned and done and demonstrated that we could do. And even though they have drawn down on that $300, nearly $400 million line of credit, I still maintain that if they managed and if they planned their spending carefully, there would be no need to borrow a single penny. I believe that they can accomplish it in their 4 years, but they have this grand idea of having it done in 2 years, and that ain't going to work. But unfortunately, it does leave them with quite a bit of money in the Treasury now that they can actually spend and do other things with it, and then the burden of repaying that will be on others years down the line, because you're going to have to pay this off over a period of, I think it is 15 years. So it's going to require quite a bit of government resources in order to accomplish that.
And again, certainly to restate, they would argue that why didn't you do it in your administration? The answer is we did do it in your administration. It worked then, a proven track record for success, and it will work now. Yeah.
And I would just conclude this discussion with that, Austin. Is the validity that we gained, from someone like Marla Dukaran, who says consistently Cayman was the best run economy. And, she talks about how the economy we ran was a counter-cyclical policies that we implemented. That's the proper economic way to describe it. When we say counter-cyclical, you save money in good times, and in bad times you spend it. And that way it tends to even out the peaks and the troughs. And it just really gives you stability and good growth. And that's what we experienced for 8 solid years.
Well, we know your thoughts on what government can do to help people get through this crisis, having discussed them here on the show, which of course now is in the wider public domain, so we won't go into them here again, other than to note that they have listened to you regarding the pension holiday and seem to have reinstated that. But what I picked up on was the need for the Premier to address the country on what may be happening to our economy and what the government intends to do about it. Do you believe it's time for the Premier to address the nation, so to speak?
Yeah. Austin, I really wish that the government, in particular the Premier, would speak more often to the country. And it has been months since we've heard from them on anything of any real substance. And it is absolutely necessary, I think, for them to be able to speak and to reassure the country, let the country know what it is they're doing, what are they thinking, and to keep us all informed. And I just don't see it happening. It's quite noticeable, the absence of any real engagement with the public.
Well, Mr. Leader, certainly the public cannot criticize your engagement with them, and certainly with us, and we are grateful for the time that you have shared with us. It was both informative and extremely sobering as well. And to our listening audience, we hope you too enjoyed our discussion. If you did, remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. for another episode of Let's Talk, exploring the issues affecting all of our lives. I'm your host, Austin Harris. Until next time.